By the way, some of you probably remember in the Cold War that the West Germany traded with the Soviet Union, and the Americans disliked that intensely. And there was much tension between the United States and Germany, West Germany, over trading with the Soviet Union.
And there was a precedent, one pipeline got blown up in the 80s by the US in Russia.
Is that right?
Yes.
Oh, wow. So we have, it's like history repeating itself. Could we say that? I actually have a first question for you. You've made it quite clear that you agree with most of the things that Mearsheimer is presenting here. And I'd really like to know what you disagree with, because I'm sure there's something.
Okay, well, I'm not quite as hopeful as John. So I'm more pessimistic. So I think this has the potential to spiral out of control a bit more. I mean, you believe that rationality will prevail. When I see some of the current leaders and their actions, is very reassuring, but I don't share it 100%.
Would you agree? Because it doesn't sound too hopeful to me, what you just presented. You know, you said there's no way out.
Well, I would ask Max, what do you think is going to happen? I mean, are you fearful of nuclear escalation? I mean, what?
Yeah, I still think that maybe NATO will get involved. That's my greatest anxiety, on the ground or in whichever way. If I listen to the talk, that does not seem to be out of the question.
Yeah, let me make 2 points just on the escalation issue. First of all, I think if the Russians were to lose or to start losing, I believe they would use nuclear weapons to rescue the situation, okay? So what that means is that the West's policy of defeating Russia inside of Ukraine makes the likelihood of nuclear war go up, if it works. In other words, if the West succeeds, if German policy succeeds in Ukraine, you make the risk of nuclear war go up. It's very important to understand that. The reason I didn't pay much attention to nuclear escalation in my comments, as Max is pointing out, is because I think the Russians are in the driver's seat now, and the Russians will ultimately win the war, and therefore nuclear weapons will not be used. But with regard to the United States coming into the war, if I'm right and the Russians are winning, there'll be a very serious temptation for the United States to come in. That's where the great power war comes. And I cannot rule that out any more than you can rule out nuclear war in this case. So we are in a really dangerous situation for sure.
So, Otte, you've actually, Mr. Otte, you've actually painted or sort of 3 scenarios in your book, right? Weltsystemcrash. And I'm surprised that you have such a poor outlook on the future, because the full-scale war, you didn't say it was the most likely scenario. The most likely scenario, you said, would be something like a new Cold War, right? With the highest probability, you'd have 2 dominant blocs, US and China, and India and Russia, the status would be open, right? So do you still consider that to be the highest probability?
I wrote about 3 scenarios in 19. The new Cold War, Chinese bloc. I mean, it's totally in line with John's thinking and arguments. A Chinese bloc, a US-dominated Western bloc, with more integration of Europe into the US sphere of influence. And at that point I said the status of Russia is open, but it could be either in the Western or in the Chinese bloc. This is just 4 years ago. And that was my most likely, not my most desired scenario. And my least likely and most desired scenario was a multipolar world with a strong Europe. But even then I said that's very unlikely. And I think John would completely agree, or would you?
But you know what I would like to add to that? You have something in common with Chancellor Scholz. He actually, well, maybe just the word, he actually just recently, in a speech in front of the EU Parliament, spoke about the world being a multipolar world. So I found this very interesting for him to use this word. Am I giving it too much weight, even like talking about it? Or how would he even define a multipolar world, our Chancellor?
Well, I think multipolar today means China, Russia, and the United States. And there are still some people who think the United States is so powerful we live in a unipolar world, and some other people who think that Russia really doesn't count as a great power, especially if you look at its rather poor military performance so far in eastern Ukraine, and therefore it's a bipolar world. But I think most people believe that we live in a multipolar world. And this is wonderful news for the Russians and the Chinese. The Russians and the Chinese love to hear people talk about living in a multipolar world. Usually, you would expect a German chancellor to say that he or she likes the unipolar world, because the unipolar world is dominated by the United States. And as you all know, Germans love the idea of being dominated by the United States. So unipolarity is a good thing. And by the way, if we were truly in a unipolar world, we wouldn't have this conflict with the Russians, right? It was the fact that the unipolar world came to an end. And the same thing is true with China, right? Until China rose and we moved into a multipolar world, there was no US-China competition. You want to think, by the way, just parenthetically, a lot of people in the West or in the United States will say that China is a threat because it's a communist state. This is communism versus liberal democracy. That's the China-US competition. My response to that is China was a communist state during the 1990s. It was a communist state up until 2017, right? And we got along perfectly well with the Chinese. There were no problems at all. What changed was the balance of power. China became really rich, began to translate its economic might into military might, and that is why you moved into a multipolar world. But we now would prefer a unipolar world where China's down here and we're up there. But those days are gone.
Maybe we can speak about China for a moment. I think you just introduced the topic really well. And I think the China and German relations, you know, they're going. They've been seeing each other quite a lot the past couple of months. I think there were 3 visits between Foreign Minister Baerbock and the Foreign Minister of China. And China, they don't like to talk about a war in Ukraine. They like to talk about a crisis. But you see them seeing each other over and over again. So what does that tell us? What does that tell us? What is Germany trying to do? What is our foreign minister trying to do? Trying to convince China to negotiate with Russia, or trying to actually keep China from closer relations to Russia? What is happening?
Well, as I said, I think once Germany loses Russia as a trading partner, it makes it more important than ever for Germany to trade with China. And the same thing is true with the French. Macron was over in China as well, and Macron was playing nice with China. And the reason Macron was playing nice with China is he wants to trade with China. By the way, some of you probably remember in the Cold War that the West Germany traded with the Soviet Union, and the Americans disliked that intensely. And there was much tension between the United States and Germany, West Germany, over trading with the Soviet Union.
And there was a precedent. One pipeline got blown up in the 80s by the US in Russia.
Is that right?
Yes.
Oh, wow. So we have, it's like history repeating itself. Could we say that? You know, you just mentioned Nord Stream 2. I find that so interesting. So what is your opinion on that? I would like to hear what you have to say about that.
Well, I think it's clear the Russians did not blow up Nord Stream. It's clear the Germans did not blow up Nord Stream. And I think it really sort of comes down to whether you believe the Americans did it or whether the Ukrainians and the Poles did it. My view is that Seymour Hersh is right and that the Americans did it. The Americans effectively said they were going to do it. Numerous American policymakers, including the president, effectively said they were going to do it. There was great pleasure in the United States when it was done. And the former foreign minister of Poland thanked the United States immediately after it was done, Mr. Sikorsky. So I think there's a lot of evidence that it was the Americans who did it. And by the way, I think the fact that the German media is not paying any attention or hardly any attention to this issue, and the German government is paying hardly any attention to this issue, is because they don't want to have to reveal that the result of their investigation is that the United States did it, because that would do enormous damage to America's position in Europe in general and in Germany in particular.
What is your opinion on it? Why do you think that the media doesn't care or the politicians aren't trying to figure out? Do you think it could actually have a dismal effect on German and US relations, even if it were to come out that the US did it?
It would have a significant effect, I mean, because right now there's really a matrix. I mean, we don't hear much in mainstream media, and I mean, Axel Springer got bought up by a US private equity just a few years ago, and Spiegel and Die Zeit get grants from the US, from the Gates Foundation. You can look it up in the foundation report. So there's quite, and then there's of course the transatlantic media connections that up to 7-8 years ago you could talk about openly also in talk shows, but you can't anymore. So it's really very much voicing US positions. And as Robert Habeck, the greatest economics minister of all times, said he wanted to be in a serving leadership role. Serving what? Serving whom? Certainly not Germany. Yes, I mean, public opinion right now is polarized, which is happening often in times like this when people do not know what to think. You give them simple explanations, you give them a scapegoat. Putin is a scapegoat. We've heard a more complex explanation from John. But this issue would have the potential of breaking that matrix. But right now it's not happening because there's very strong interests to keep it under cover. And there's just a few of us who say it openly, but we don't get much distribution in the media, or none at all. And we're being denounced.
Mm-hmm. Doesn't sound very hopeful. John, I just have a really clear-cut question for you right now. I really would like to know what you think of our foreign minister, Minister Annalena Baerbock. I'd just like to know.
I'm going to plead the Fifth Amendment.
No, I don't think, we're not in the United States, so you can't plead the Fifth over here.
Well, Americans apply their law exterritorially, so...
Very true.
I know because I pay American taxes, of course, as an American citizen, but...
Well, maybe you could give us a diplomatic answer, just from your point of view as a political science
I think the foreign
expert.
minister's views on the Ukraine war are completely misguided. And I think that they are making a bad situation worse. I think when you look at German leadership today and you compare it to German leadership during the Cold War, it's like night and day. I think that during the Cold War, and even in much of the unipolar moment, the post-Cold War period up to 2017.
What about US leadership there?
No, I think that U.S. leadership has oftentimes been terrible, I'm not arguing that the Biden administration has a smart policy on Ukraine for 1 second. The Biden administration's policy is misguided. You want to remember that Joe Biden handled the Ukraine portfolio in the Obama administration. When Joe Biden was the vice president, he was tasked with handling Ukraine. And he was known in the administration after 2014, when the crisis broke out, as a super hawk on Ukraine. So it's no accident that when he moved into the White House in January 2021, that's when he moves in. Over the course of that year, 2021, the crisis escalated, and then the war broke out in early 2022, a little bit after a year that he had moved into the White House. And it's because Biden was tightening the screws on the Russians with regard to Ukraine. We were going to greater lengths under Biden than we had under Trump to bring Ukraine into NATO, to make it, at that time, a de facto member of NATO. This was, in my opinion, a remarkably foolish policy. So when you talk about Baerbock and her views, I have little use for them, but I have little use for Joe Biden's views or Anthony Blinken's views or Jake Sullivan's views. I think all of these individuals have been pushing the West to pursue a foreign policy that has blown up in our face, and as I tried to make clear in my formal comments, is going to linger for a long time and cause all sorts of problems here in Europe, cause all sorts of problems in Russia, and most of all in Ukraine. What has happened to Ukraine is an unmitigated disaster. There's no hope of repairing this situation in any meaningful way for the Ukrainians. I just think that all of these policymakers made an egregious error.
Mm-hmm. I have a follow-up question on that. There's a presidential campaign or election coming up, 2024, in the United States. And I think one of the favorable candidates, Mr. Donald Trump, I mean, he's in the runs again. And he just said a couple of days ago at a CNN town hall that he would be able to shut down Ukraine, you know, the crisis, in a day. What do you think about that?
Well, he's not going to do that. I mean, just 2 points to be made. As I said to you here, there's no way to shut this one down because there's no deal to be had. There's just no deal. The second point is both Barack Obama in 2008 and Donald Trump in 2016 were elected on the platform that they were going to fundamentally alter American foreign policy. You remember when Donald Trump was first elected, he was going to have or establish good relations with the Russians. He was going to end NATO. He was going to get the Americans out of Europe, and so forth and so on. He didn't do that. In fact, NATO survived Donald Trump. U.S.-Russian relations under Donald Trump got worse. Donald Trump was the president who in 2017 decided to start arming the Ukrainians. Obama wouldn't arm the Ukrainians. It was Donald Trump who did. What happened here, and this is what happened to Obama as well, and Obama said this, is that the foreign policy establishment, or what we call the blob in the United States, beat Obama down and they beat Trump down. So if Trump gets elected, the idea that he will be an independent force who can alter American foreign policy by himself is delusional. He's not going to do that. He has to work with the deep state. He has to work with all of these other interest groups and other elites in the United States who will go to great lengths to make sure we remain deeply committed to the status quo. And by the way, the same thing is true with Republicans versus Democrats. A number of Republicans have said that we're not going to continue to support Ukraine forever. And they have made it appear like we will bail out, we will abandon Ukraine. But if you look carefully, they're small in number. Many of them have walked back their comments. DeSantis, for example, has now said that he's a staunch supporter of Ukraine. So the Republicans and the Democrats are both behind supporting Ukraine for the foreseeable future. And Donald Trump can say what he wants in the campaign, but once he's sitting in the White House, assuming he gets elected, he'll support the status quo.
Interesting. I'd like to pose a question to you, Mr. Otte. I read some of your dissertation that you published, I think it was done around the 2000s, right?
It was written in '96 and published in 2000.
It was very interesting for me to understand how post DDR or after the unification process in Germany, how Germany actually established itself like in the international order. And there was one sentence that stuck out to me, I already told you, and you wrote, "It is our prediction that Germany will continue to remain a force of the status quo for a long time to come." Now granted, you wrote this 20 years ago, but I really wanted to ask you what you thought about that today and what you thought about what you think about Germany's force or role today, and if it's still a force of status quo.
It remained a force of the status quo because it's a middle power, and the thesis was that middle powers try to balance and to be good neighbors and to be friendly and so use influence that way. Of course, there was NATO, we didn't have nuclear arms, and so that was the basic argument that Germany would basically, because there was fear in the US in the early 90s that Germany would aspire to get nuclear arms, that it would become more aggressive and so on and so forth. There was a huge debate. So my prediction was it would stay a middle power, intent on maintaining good relations and all these things. And it has done so. It has done so. And but for the past couple of years, of course, we have seen a world system really upside down in turmoil. I mean, there's still the Western Bloc, the Western Alliance, there's China, there's Russia, the status of which was undetermined just a few years ago. I mean, we could see where it was tipping. It was, we were alienating it, but maybe this is a backdoor comment on our foreign minister, but Germany does not have much of an independent foreign policy left. I mean, we see it with the energy policy lobbies, foreign lobbies. I mean, foreign lobbying in the US is a cardinal sin. But in Germany, foreign lobbying is ever present. And so there's not much of an apparatus that formulates and does anything like a national strategy. So yes, we've been a power of the status quo, but right now we're, let's say, just more or less a territory with that is being manipulated with not much of an independent policy. I mean, it's basically following the US lead. John has talked about that we like to do that. And so we're in a situation where we're not sure what the status quo really is, but for a long time it has been a power of the status quo.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What do you see, what role would you see that Germany could play in the foreseeable future? And maybe I'd like to elaborate on that question, because you did say that Angela Merkel did not support the Bucharest initiative to include Ukraine into NATO 2008. And then you said that she also wasn't, she didn't pursue Minsk, or she didn't make Ukraine pursue Minsk. So that to me seems a little bit contradictory, right? She knew that it would cause harm, right, to follow the strategy of including Ukraine into NATO. But then again, she didn't really try to make Ukraine follow Minsk. So how does that go together?
It's hard to say. The Minsk process started after the conflict broke out in 2014. And after that, the nature of the situation involving Ukraine changed. In other words, in 2008, when Merkel was opposed to NATO expansion, the issue was just on the table. There had been no decision made. So it was a prime opportunity for her to oppose bringing Ukraine into NATO, and she did. The problem is that she caved in, right? Then with regard to Minsk, right, you had the conflict already starting, and she just, I guess, felt that, that it was appropriate or important to let Ukraine get more powerful, to string the Russians along and let Ukraine get more powerful. I mean, I'm not, privy to her deep thoughts about why to do this. But I think it was just two different situations.
Maybe you have a slightly different view as a, let's play amateur psychologist, but probably she did actually believe in Minsk too. And now that she's seeing that the tide has turned, she wants to get on the right side of the argument. So that would be more like her, I would think so.
That would eliminate the contradiction that Jasmine pointed out.
Perhaps.
Perhaps.
And just a quick one. Do you think Germany could at all play a significant role, maybe with a different leadership, who knows, to maybe help improve the situation with Ukraine and then therefore also with Russia?
See, the reason I'm so pessimistic is I don't think if you put me in charge of German foreign policy that I could do much to fix the situation. What I tried to convey here tonight is that we have got ourselves into a situation where there is no solution. It's not like you need to, bring back Otto von Bismarck from the dead and put him in the chancellor's office, and he can then figure out how to get out of this. There's just no real solution that's available. Because of the problems that I explained to you. The Russians don't want to give up that territory. The Ukrainians want it back. The whole neutrality issue, Ukraine wants a security guarantee. I mean, I just don't see how you solve those problems. And so many people have now died, and the relations between the West and the East are so poisonous. I mean, I just don't see how you repair all these things anytime soon. So no optimism? So look, maybe I'm wrong. I've been in this business for a long time, and I understand that, we're trying to predict what the future looks like, and prediction is a really tricky business. And there is some chance that I'll be wrong. Let's hope that I'm wrong. Let's hope that this situation changes drastically over the course of the next couple of years, and I have egg all over my face. I would be happy if that proved to be the case. But I just, when I look at the available evidence and I think about it in a logical fashion, it looks pretty grim to me moving forward.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for that, John. And I'm not gonna, yes, we're gonna take a break now. I'm not gonna ask you for an optimistic outlook into the future. I already know you're a bit pessimistic, but we are going to take a break. A 10-minute break for drinks and maybe, just to take a breather. And then we'll come back with a Q&A, and you guys will have the opportunity to ask questions. So I'm sure we'll have some interesting things to talk about. So yes, let's break.